Okay, hopefully you got a drink of water, because we're back. Now we're going to talk not about how a budget is arrived at, but what the US federal budget consists of. And it's really worth noting that budgets year to year aren't that different. Remember that we talked about in the last lecture that principle of incremental, or what's sometimes called baseline budgeting, where over time you use the previous year's budget as the basis for the current year's budget. You don't start over every year. So budgets tend to creep up over and over again, and many of the things we're going to talk about in this lecture remain the same. So the first thing I want to get out of the way is a basic distinction between fiscal and monetary policy. Pound that into your head, because we're going to talk about it again and again and again later this year in some of the other units, for example, about the Federal Reserve. Fiscal policy are the choices that the legislature makes in terms of discretionary spending and in terms of mandatory spending about how they're going to spend money. Fiscal policy does not include crucial ways that the government regulates the economy, like banking, the value of currency, and things like that. Fiscal policy is spending and debt. Spending and debt. That's all. Decisions made by the legislature and sometimes the executive, not the various other ways that the government regulates the economy or things like inflation and growth. Now, of our spending and debt, fiscal policy, we'll go back to what we talked about in the previous discussion, that most of American federal spending is mandatory. That is, other laws written by previous Congresses have created a legal obligation for the current Congress to spend this particular kind of money. That's mandatory spending. Some of it, though, is discretionary, and some of it is a special kind of mandatory called interest on the debt that just goes to pay down the interest on existing debt from previous years where we spent more than we already had. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more depth. Where does the US federal government get the revenue side of its fiscal policy? The first and most important place is from individual income taxes, the ones that you and everyone else and your parents all sweat over, and that the IRS enforces. The United States is kind of unusual in that citizens do their own taxes. Most countries just automatically deduct taxes correctly. You don't have to go and sweat it out yourself with a software program or something. And it's unusual in that it's a relatively new country to the income tax club. The income tax itself was actually ruled unconstitutional, as we'll discuss, and it required the 16th Amendment to specifically enable the federal government to create an income tax. Payroll taxes are a little bit different. Income tax is paid just by you, according to percentages, which we're going to discuss, out of your paycheck. Payroll taxes are paid also by percentages, but they're paid much more equally. They're much more flat than income taxes, where high earners pay a lot more than low earners. They're much more flat than income taxes, but they are really importantly paid simultaneously by you and your employer. If your payroll tax rate is $1,000, your employer also pays $1,000. Payroll taxes are very different. You also have corporate income taxes. Corporate income taxes are very similar to individual income taxes, but they follow different brackets or percentage rates, and they generally include a much wider variety of types of income, like capital income and things like that, that are often exempt from or very differently calculated under individual income taxes. Everything else, things like customs and excise, means a tax on a specific good, like luxury good taxes or excise taxes, make up only 5% of all the revenue. So if you think about all the money the federal government rakes in from fines every year, for example, fining people for things, that's like, maybe 2% of all of their income. Now, the problem is that between that revenue and that spending that we were just talking about, there's always a gap. There have only been a few years in the past few decades in which the United States has not spent more than it took in each given year. So just to give you a sense of what that means, that's the deficit. So when you spend more than you take in, that's the deficit. Please don't confuse debt and deficit. You laugh now, you say, oh, I would never be that dumb. But every year on the AP, someone does it. So just remember, deficit is spending more than you take in year to year, while debt is the accumulated deficit over time that you owe to other sources. The best way to look at debt and deficit usually is percentage of GDP. The numbers are staggering, and it's very difficult to wrap your head around numbers in the billions or trillions. Instead, it's easier to wrap your head around how much money the government is spending more than it has as a percentage of the whole economy, because government spending is a substantial portion of the whole economy, between 17 and 22%, sometimes more like 30%. This gives you a better sense. So if the government's spending is, let's just put it at, 22% of the entire economy in any given year, let's say 2008, it was about 3% of that was debt that the federal government was taking on. So it was spending about 3% of the money that was of the economy was federal debt. So where does the deficit itself come from? Before we talk about debt, we're going to talk about deficit a little bit. So where does it come from? Well, first you just have to look at the gap between spending and revenue. In 2001, this is a slightly old chart, but it's a really nice visual reference, so I'm going to go ahead and keep using it. In 2001, in 2001, we took in about 19% of GDP, and we spent about 18% of GDP in terms of the amount that the federal government was taking in and spending. The other advantage here of using GDP is it accounts for inflation. So you're not looking at numbers, and you don't have to think about, the fact that $1 in 2001 was worth $1.50 today, and so on. Anyway, so this means we actually had a net higher revenue than we had GDP. We were taking in more money than we were spending. There was no deficit. In both cases, we were spending some money on tax expenditures. That's money that the government voluntarily doesn't take in that it could take in taxes because it's giving someone a tax break, or it's cutting taxes temporarily to encourage the economy, or something like that. There's a huge difference when you look at 2011 versus 2001. In 2011, government spending had jumped to 24% of GDP. Government was spending much larger percentage of GDP in 2011 than it was in 2001. There are lots of reasons for this, right? Overall, the economy had shrunk because of the recession, and so the GDP number itself was slightly smaller, and therefore government spending was a larger proportion of it. But also a number of programs, often designed to help the economy, and several wars had increased the amount of government spending, so it's a larger percentage of GDP. However, revenue decreased. In 2001, government revenue was 19% of GDP. But in 2011, we took in a lot less in individual income taxes and payroll taxes, which meant that we were only taking in 15% of GDP. That meant that in 2011, there was a very large deficit. That had been true every year since 2002. So in 2001, we had just a very slight positive balance, but by 2011, and for most of the years preceding that, and every year after that since, we have had a negative balance. Now, when you add all those years from 1970 on forward that we've had, generally speaking, negative balances on up, you get our overall debt. And again, we're going to use percentage of GDP because that accounts for inflation, it accounts for the changing size of the economy, and so on. The height, of course, of U.S. debt is during wars. We had 112% of the economy as debt that we owed in 1945, but it got paid down until 2011 when we reached 67.7, and right now in 2016, when I'm recording this lecture, it's at about 71 or 72% of GDP. And you can see that there's not really a Democratic or Republican bias in terms of who creates and who pays down debt, right? So here we have World War II and the Great Depression, where you have Eisenhower, Reagan, and so on. Then you have increasing debt. You can sort of track it by president. So where does the debt come from? Where are we losing money? What are the places we are losing the most money? And this one is not GDP. This is just a straight number. So you've got to be careful with straight numbers. But generally speaking, you've got a number of sources of places where you're losing money. The most important is revenue. The United States takes in less in taxes than it could, and often it takes in less in taxes year to year. So just as an example of one of the things that lost us, that $3,426 billion that we call revenue loss, is when the economy tanks, like it did in 2008 and like it sort of hovered around doing this year, people make less money and people get laid off their jobs. When people make less money and people get laid off their jobs, revenue falls because they can't pay very much in income taxes. So it's a really important thing to understand that when the nation's economy does badly, the government takes in less money because individuals can pay less in taxes. So when you see that, for example, debt went up under Obama, you have to remember that he took office during a recession, so the government was making less money. In addition, he did choose to spend money. That's where things like the TARP come in, or technical and economic changes, or the 2010 Tax Act. Those are all things that President Obama or the Congress or the Recovery Act chose to do that were also important expenditures of money that were debt expenditures, and so drove us into debt. This chart is from 2014. Our total debt growth right now is more like 15 trillion, but the ratios of these categories have stayed the same. Even though total debt growth today is more like 15 or 16 trillion, a lot of it still comes from revenue loss, a lot of it still comes from Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of it still comes from tax acts and things like that. It's also worth taking a look at what our percentage of government debt, remember, debt, to GDP is compared to other countries. Now, the United States often says, oh, our debt is terrible, and it's not fantastic. We have about 60%, a little bit more, 67% of GDP as debt. But other countries, like Italy, for example, or God forbid, Japan, have really tremendous percentages of debt to GDP. So where we stand in the world is a more complicated matter than it's often made out to be in the media. If you just look just at the OECD countries, again, we fall somewhere in the top third. We have a fair amount of debt, but we're fairly similar to other large countries, like France, Canada, and the UK, who have less debt, but not that much less than we do. So if we are a debtor because of repeated deficits, who owns the debt? And it's worth noting that our debt is not a bad thing. People are jumping all over themselves to lend us money, in essence, because the way that the US government gets lent money isn't the way you go to your parents and ask them for money. It isn't even the way that an individual goes to the bank and asks the bank for money. Instead, the United States government takes an IOU that's called a federal banknote or a Federal Reserve note. This Federal Reserve note, or often called a federal bond, is placed out on an open market. So let's say they come in a denomination like $10,000. It's this Federal Reserve note, or this federal bond, is an IOU from the US government saying, in 10 years, I will owe you $10,000 plus 1% interest. People then bid on that bond. People will sometimes bid $15,000 to buy the US bond that is worth $10,000 plus 1% interest in 10 years. So you're not going to China, for example, and saying, hey, China, can you lend me some money? Instead, China is saying, I would like to buy that certificate from you, which says that in 10 years, you will owe me $10,000 plus 1% interest. So that's the way U.S. debt works. It's very different than you'd think. It's this series of Federal Reserve notes and Federal Reserve draft things. So, and these are the people who buy them. Sometimes our own Social Security fund buys U.S. bonds, because Social Security is going to have to pay out over time. So if every year Social Security is getting money from the bonds that it bought that mature, then it can pay out its debt in time. The U.S. Federal Reserve buys back some of its own bonds. That's very complicated, but they can certainly do it. State and local government could buy a U.S. bond. So when people talk about the sheer amount of money that we owe to China as a really good example, what that really means is that of all of the federal bonds that are out there that the U.S. government has sold, China owns about 8 to 10% of them. So what about the revenue side? Where do we get our money? Well, like I was saying, we have an income tax, and that's the main source. It took the 16th Amendment as a response to an 1895 decision that said that the federal government couldn't create an income tax under the Constitution to get us an income tax. And it's important to note that our income tax is progressive. This doesn't mean that it's interested in Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or whatever you want to call it. It means that rates are curved so that the higher your income is, the higher the tax rate you pay. That's all a progressive tax rate means. It's not a political term. It just means more money, you pay a higher percentage. There are other ways to do taxation. Because we grow up in the United States, we tend to think, oh, progressive taxation, well, duh, isn't that what everyone does? But there are a lot of other ways to think about it. There are flat taxes, VAT taxes, there are consumption taxes. There's all kinds of ways to imagine raising money for government. When you file for your personal income tax, you don't file just as you. You file as what's called a unit or a filing unit. There's all kinds of ways to file your personal income taxes. You can be a single person, you can be a married couple filing one single tax, you could be a married couple filing separate taxes, you could file taxes for your personal business. Oh, it's complicated. Similarly, there's a corporate income tax that follows a similar set of rules, but unlike in personal income tax, the choices you're making are always what kind of company you want to file as, an LLC, a public company, a corporation, a limited. It's, again, complex. You don't need to know all of it, but it's worth noting that they are analogous. They are both progressive, and in both of them, you have to make a choice about what kind of unit you're filing your taxes as. However, it's not a straight curve. American taxation is progressive and bracketed. To understand what bracketed means, I'll show you a graph here. What happens is if I'm making a certain amount of money, let's say from $0 to $10,000, I pay about 15% of that money. The next step is here at about $75,000. So once I start making $75,000, my actual payment hasn't been going up the whole time. From $10,000 to $75,000, I've been paying 15% on all of that. Every dollar that I make over $75,000, though, here, will be taxed at a different rate. Every dollar that I make over $75,000 or so is going to be taxed at about 25%. Similarly, once I get to $175,000, every dollar that I pay will be taxed a little bit higher. So this avoids the problem of not wanting to make more money because you'll pay more in taxes. Because the idea is every dollar that I make over the bracket, that's the only dollar that's taxed at the higher rate. So only my $10,001st was taxed at 25%. Only my $175,001st is taxed at 29%, and so on. The U.S. federal income tax today caps out a little bit below 40%. This is a real contrast with other countries and with the United States past. Back during the 1950s and 60s, for example, the very top bracket capped out at almost 90%. So there's been a real change in how large a percentage of the highest incomes we tax. The other thing that we do is we have what are called tax expenditures. And I mentioned these earlier as an important way the United States government spends money. They're spending money, but they're not spending it. It's a very complicated idea. What a tax expenditure is when you decide to not take in some taxes that you might otherwise take in. You voluntarily pass a law or make an exemption that means you're not going to receive some tax money as a government you might otherwise receive, usually because there's some particular purpose that you want that to serve. So just one example of this is the college tuition tax credit, or the college loan interest tax credit, or perhaps the mortgage interest tax credit. The mortgage interest tax credit is a really good one. I'll spend a minute on it. The U.S. government knows that it's good for the economy when people buy houses. People with houses tend to be more stable. They tend to be able to invest more. Building houses is a really important driver of other kinds of economic activity because it requires tons of industry and jobs to support it. The government knows that they want people to buy houses. So if you buy a house and you take on a gigantic loan, a mortgage, to do so, you can actually take the amount of money that you spend on paying off the interest on that loan and deduct it from your federal income taxes. You pay less. It's a way for government to encourage people to buy houses by allowing them to pay less in taxes than they otherwise would. That's a tax expenditure, and it costs the government money it might otherwise make, but it's serving an important goal for the government. There are tons of these in a wide variety of places. So what other kinds of taxes are there besides the income taxes? The most important to know about is the FICA or payroll taxes. Payroll taxes, as I said at the very beginning of this lecture, in case you'd forgotten, are paid by both you and your employer. Medicare FICA is about 1.5% from your paycheck for you and for your employer. Social Security FICA is about 6.5% for you and your employer, which means that on top of whatever taxes you're paying for your income tax, you pay an additional 15.3 or about 17%, depending, um, of your tax dollars go to these FICA taxes, and then that amount basically doubles for the federal government because your employer is paying the same amount. They don't take that out of your paycheck; they're just paying the same amount. Now, what's important about FICA taxes is they don't go to the general fund of the United States government. The FICA taxes are earmarked. They go off into their own separate pile of funds that are used to pay for the programs that are named in their title. So the Social Security FICA tax goes into the Social Security Fund. The Medicare FICA tax goes only to pay for Medicare. Now that's in theory. In reality, there are ways that the federal government can manipulate the trust funds that those programs have in order to use that money for other purposes. But in theory, at least, Social Security and Medicare are both earmarked taxes in addition to being payroll taxes. They have one last weird thing that's useful to note, which is that they both have what are called compensation limits. Once you make above a certain amount of money for Social Security, for example, it's about $1 million, those dollars are no longer subject to taxation for Social Security and Medicare. This extra 6.5% goes away for all the money above that amount. So again, this is a look at our projected tax revenue. You saw it earlier. Just take another look and remember that the two biggest sources are payroll taxes and individual income taxes, with individual income taxes being a great deal more. These are the big tax expenditures, just to give you a sense of the sheer number of tax expenditures. So the federal government wants its citizens to spend money on healthcare, to buy medical insurance. So if the employer helps to pay for your medical insurance, the employer no longer has to pay tax on the money it spent for that purpose as part of its corporate income tax. That costs the federal government about $131 billion a year. If you or your employer contributes money to your pension, that money doesn't count towards the income that they are taxing. So that costs us money. And again, this serves something that the government wants. The government wants its citizens to save for retirement. So you can take a look at these and choose a few. Child credit is one that might particularly interest you. People who have kids get special credits to get taxed less. You might just be a tax benefit for your parents. No, I'm just kidding. This is another way to look at the tax expenditures. You can pause and take a look at it in some detail if you want to. And they really do add up. They would help if we had no tax expenditures, and that's unlikely and probably crazy because every country in the world has a lot of tax expenditures. It's an important way for government to encourage people to do things they want them to do. We would actually almost erase a big chunk of our deficit overnight. So, what about spending? Looking at our discretionary spending, of course, the largest chunk of discretionary spending goes to the military. Everything else is pittance compared to the military. And these are huge areas. So just for example, government. That means all of the random federal services that are out there doing studies, doing grants, writing requests, doing research, that's all of that. Just paying to run the Social Security program, not paying out for Social Security, really important, but running Social Security and running unemployment, all of OSHA that makes sure that people are safe on the workplace, that's less than 5% or so of all federal discretionary spending. All the money we ever spent on foreign aid or going to the UN or anything like that, or international medicine efforts, all that sort of stuff, that goes under international affairs, 3%. The EPA, large as it is, 3%. Education grants to colleges and universities and school systems and all of the school lunch program and all of that kind of stuff, 6%. Food and agriculture includes, for example, the food stamp program, 1%. So when you're talking about this amount of money, these 1%, 2%, these are big programs, but they are dwarfed by the big chunks like the military, Social Security, and Medicaid and Medicare. Part of the reason the United States spends so much on the military is the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that went over about the last decade. So the blue bar here is the amount more than inflation that the DoD's budget increased. So this green bar is just if you took the basic DoD budget in 2001, the Department of Defense budget in 2001, and you increased it for inflation. The blue is everything new above inflation that the DoD got. And the red is everything special the DoD got in specialty bills just for Iraq and Afghanistan. So you can see that the national security state, the Department of Defense, is a complicated beast in terms of why it costs so much money. It's always been expensive. Starting in 2001, you can go all the way back to the Cold War. But in the past several years, it's gotten more expensive for a variety of reasons. It's increased a great deal more than it would have had it just increased with inflation each year. This gives you a longer term sense. This is 1947. And then it moves on up with the Cold War at its height here and here. And you can see Vietnam here. You can see the Reagan defense buildup here and so on. But it's really interesting to put this in a different perspective. If military is so expensive, it is worth noting that it's not that expensive as a percentage of the whole budget. So in 1955, the military spending, even though it was relatively low comparatively to other years, was 70% of the federal budget. It's not until the 1960s and 1980s that we notice that federal spending, even though it's high on defense, becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of the total federal budget outlay. So it's really interesting to see that even though we're talking about it being 55% of discretionary spending, it's only about 23% of government spending overall. We do account for most of the global military spending, right? The entire rest of the world is 320 plus these guys, right? And our next closest rivals, Japan, Russia, and China, couldn't even equal less than half of our military spending, even if they wanted to. So mandatory spending is, of course, the other piece of the spending puzzle. Social Security, unemployment, and labor covers a wide variety of programs that the U.S. government is required to pay. There's a bill about unemployment that says that the U.S. government and the state governments shall work together to provide unemployment benefits for a certain number of weeks if you've been laid off. That's a law. The government has to follow it. It has to provide that funding. Similarly, if you qualify for Medicare, if you're over the age of 65 and you enroll, the federal government has to pay it. They have no option. They can't control that in their discretionary spending bills or as part of the budget process. So it's worth noting that those are required. Part of the reason these things are so expensive as a percentage of the federal budget is because we have a relatively old and aging population. Now, this is kind of a distorted graph because the very top of the graph is 25%, but we're inching closer and closer to having nearly a quarter of our population be over the age of 65. When they're over the age of 65, they qualify for both Social Security and Medicare, which would make those programs a lot more expensive. In addition, because those programs are partially funded or mostly funded through payroll taxes, if someone leaves the workforce and retires, they're no longer paying the payroll taxes on those items. So they begin to take in money from those at the same time as they stop paying into them. So it's a very important and interesting thing to note that the graying America we talked about way back in the first quarter is a big part of the reason why federal mandatory spending has exploded. This is just another way of looking at the same thing. And this is another way of looking at the same thing, that more and more people are retiring, and so there are fewer people in the workforce per beneficiary of Social Security. And it's really important to understand that Social Security is not a small thing. It's clearly not a small thing in terms of government expenditures, but it's also not a small thing in terms of the difference it makes in people's lives. For people in the lowest, second, and middle income quintiles, right? So if you divided all the earners in the United States into 5 equal tranches, this would be the main ones, right? So the quintile limits are 10,800, 16,043, 24,000, and 43. So everybody here is making below about the median income. These people are making above the median income by a good bit. Social Security makes up a lot of people's income when they are older. It makes up, if you're among the poorest people in the United States and you're over the age of 65, your Social Security check accounts for about 82% of your income. That's huge. If you're a little bit, if you make a little bit more than that, about $16,000, your Social Security accounts for 86% of your total income. So people really do depend on Social Security for their income as they get older. It's not just sort of a academic concern about what we'll do about it over time. And it's really important to note also that we are reaching an inflection point where it's going to become more and more expensive and quickly to run Social Security the way that we run it, and revenue is going to continue to steeply go down at the same time. So something needs to be done in the next 10 to 15 years to change the way that we either fund or give out the Social Security program, which you'll see. Medicare is, of course, the other expensive program, and again, it's focused on the elderly. And you can see that it's increasing a great deal as more and more people become older, and as medical care itself becomes more expensive. Medical care is one of the great inflationary items. It's become more expensive at a much faster rate than inflation. And so Medicare has grown not only as the number of people who qualify for it has grown, but it's also grown as the care which Medicare gives has gotten more expensive and more things have become available. And it's projected, of course, to continue to increase even more. And as you can see here, more and more people are enrolled, some of whom are people who are disabled. This is another population that can qualify for Medicare. And this brings us to the next medical program. Medicaid is different than Medicare. Medicaid, you don't qualify for based on age, you qualify for based on poverty. This means that you could qualify for both Medicaid and Medicare if you were both elderly and very poor. Medicaid is really important because it's a state and federal funded program. It's a remnant of the old cooperative federalism. The states contribute money and the federal government contribute money, and it's a different ratio for each state. The states have some flexibility in deciding how to spend it, but there is a central national administration for Medicaid as well that enforces certain policy directives on how the states spend it. So if you look at 2010, the United States federal government was spending about $260 billion on Medicaid, and then the states were spending the next about $170 million. So states and the federal government work together to fund Medicaid with a variety of different tax structures, not an old-fashioned FICA tax. It's not funded through an old-fashioned FICA tax, at least not exactly. And what's also interesting is that state to state, there's a different amount. So this tells you about what percentage of the total Medicaid cost is paid for by the federal government versus by the state. So that wealthy states, like California, are paying more than half of their own Medicaid costs. So when California runs Medicaid, when it provides medical aid or medical money for the impoverished or the very poor, it is paying more than half of that amount. For every dollar that California spends, it gets about $1 from the federal government. On the other hand, states which are very poor, for example, West Virginia or Alabama or Mississippi, are often paying only 25% of their own expenses. The federal government is paying about 75%. So for every quarter that Alabama spends to provide medical aid to the very poor through Medicaid, the federal government is chipping in about $1. Does that make sense? Okay. There are other programs that the United States federal government runs as entitlements. Some of them are kind of entitlements and kind of discretionary. So don't cite these as your main examples. The best examples for entitlement spending are Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, and unemployment. But TANF grants are interesting because they're a particularly important part of recovering from economic difficulties. TANF is temporary aid to needy families, and it's what we think of as welfare. TANF is cash assistance. It's other services, for example, paying for people's lighting bills or heating bills or gas bills, providing free or providing payment for their child care, helping them to find employment. All of these are things that the TANF program does when someone is impoverished. So TANF ends up being fairly expensive, about $20 billion, but again, that's not that much compared to the hundreds of billions that Medicaid and other similar programs cost. But it does a wide variety of things, and it's partially effective because people can't stay on it forever. TANF is delimited. You can only stay on it for a certain amount of time as you, quote, get your feet back under yourself. We'll talk about TANF and food stamps and other things in great detail in a later chapter, but it's worth noting that they are a part of the federal expenditure map. So is SNAP, the food stamp program. And again, if you're curious about it, you can take a look at this, or you can go to the website that you can see cited here to get more information. And SNAP and TANF, both, you can see, go up tremendously when there's a economic recession, and then they begin to go down as the economy recovers and fewer people need SNAP benefits or TANF benefits to help them in their day-to-day life. The United States federal government is also an emergency management state, whether that's a financial emergency, bailing out the banks here, or hurricanes, floods, things like that. A lot of emergency management is done by providing grants to state and local government, infrastructure, and science, and a lot of emergency management is done by providing tax cuts. When the economy tanks and people are making less money, one of the easiest ways for the federal government to put more money in their pocket so that they spend more and therefore help the economy recover is to cut their taxes. Now, this is, of course, getting into economic theory. Some people will say that's less effective. Some people will say that's more effective. Not our place here. But just know that tax cuts, as the economy becomes worse, are one way that the federal government often tries to manage economic crises, in addition to things like work programs, TANF and SNAP, or grants to federal and local governments or unemployment insurance. And if you're curious about how unemployment insurance works, the way unemployment insurance works is when you're laid off, you file for unemployment. If you weren't laid off for a good reason, if there wasn't a cause, or if there was a cause but you qualify for other reasons, which is not hard, you get a certain number of weeks of aid. Some of that aid comes from your state government's unemployment funds, and some of that aid comes from the federal government's unemployment funds. It is an entitlement. You must get unemployment in the United States if you qualify for it. But the amount of time that you get can be changed by discretionary spending. So, for example, at the height of the 2008 recession, the amount of time you could get unemployment insurance for extended by about 6 months compared to normal. So, quite important. And finally, remember that principle of incremental budgeting that we talked about earlier, which is part of what drives the whole debt and deficit. All right. So think about the budget as a pie, all those pie charts that we've seen. Think about the budget process and about the different kinds of income and expenditures, fiscal policy, and you should feel ready to play the budget game next time I see you.